So in today's lecture, we're going to talk about two different topics. The first is going to be the energy for contraction. So we'll talk about kind of where the ATP is going to be coming from and the different ways to make ATP. And the second part is going to be about the force, velocity, and duration of muscle contraction and the things that go into kind of those different things. So ATP is going to be a requirement for muscle contraction, and it's going to be involved in a few different things. It's going to help move and detach the cross bridges, so the myosin heads are going to have ATP attached that then turns into ATP or ADP plus inorganic phosphate, and that's going to be extremely important. It also is going to help pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it's going to help pump sodium out of the cell and potassium back into the cell after we have kind of an action potential that's taken place, to get the membrane back to resting membrane potential. Now, the muscle will store about 4 to 6 seconds of ATP, and after that, the stores are going to be gone, and we're going to have to start producing more ATP, and there are going to be a couple different ways this can take place. Now, ATP is going to be the only source of energy that can be used for contractile activities, and so it has to be regenerated quickly. So there's not like a different energy source that we can move to. The actual ATP is the only thing that's going to be used for the actual movement and detachment of the cross bridges, the pumping of the calcium back in the SR, and the pumping of the sodium and potassium. Once that initial ATP that was stored in the muscle is used up, there are then 3 different mechanisms for regenerating ATP. The first is going to be direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. We then can have an anaerobic pathway, so this is going to be in the absence of oxygen, where we can use glycolysis and only do glycolysis and don't do the rest of the cellular respiration. And so this is going to form lactic acid. And then under aerobic conditions where oxygen is present, we can then do kind of the full cellular respiration. So here's the first type, and this is going to be direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate is this molecule that is going to be located inside the muscle cells, and there's about 2 to 3 times more creatine phosphate than there is ATP that's stored in the cells at any one time. And this creatine phosphate is going to be able to donate a phosphate to ADP, which will then instantly form ATP. Now, the enzyme that does this is going to be called creatine kinase, and it is going to carry out this transfer of the phosphate. Okay, so again, the creatine phosphate, the phosphate on the creatine will then be transferred over to ADP, forming ATP. Now, muscle fibers will have enough ATP and creatine phosphate reserves to power a cell for about 15 seconds. So this doesn't seem like a very long time, but this is kind of maximal output of the muscle. And creatine phosphate plus ADP will equal creatine plus ATP. Now, in this situation, we do not need oxygen. Okay, so oxygen can be not present for this to take place. You produce 1 ATP per creatine phosphate. Okay, and this is going to provide energy for about 15 seconds. Now, under some conditions, we are not going to have oxygen present, and there's an alternative pathway other than the creatine phosphate. And so this is going to be through glycolysis. And so glycolysis is the first step of cellular respiration. It takes place in the absence of oxygen. And when we kind of do this process, there's going to be a byproduct called lactic acid, because the pyruvic acid that's produced at the end of glycolysis cannot move on to the next stage. Okay, so ATP can be generated by breaking down the energy that's stored in glucose. So glucose does have to be present for anaerobic kind of glycolysis to take place. And this again is going to be the first step of glucose breakdown through glycolysis. No oxygen is required. Glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvic acid molecules, and 2 ATPs are generated from each glucose broken down. So you can, make some ATP, not very much, but this is going to be one of the sources for providing energy for contraction. Okay, so when there are low oxygen levels, that means the pyruvic acid will not be able to enter the aerobic respiration phase, which would be kind of the next step that would happen in the mitochondria. Now, when you have this take place, what's happening is that the pyruvic acid would normally enter the mitochondria to start the aerobic phase of cellular respiration. But when we have really high levels of an intense activity, so muscle contraction activity, oxygen is not going to be available at the high enough level for kind of pyruvic acid to go into the aerobic respiration phase. Now, when you're really working out very intensely, your muscles will be bulging and actually will compress your blood vessels, which will then impair how oxygen is delivered to the muscles. Okay, so as you're having this activity, you're going to have reduced oxygen delivery to the muscles that would need it. Okay, and so when we have the absence of oxygen, again, this is called anaerobic glycolysis, and pyruvic acid is ultimately going to be converted into lactic acid. Okay, so oxygen use in this is going to be none, and there's going to be production of 2 ATP molecules per glucose. Okay, and the duration of energy provided is about 30 to 40 seconds or slightly more, so it kind of depends on the situation. So lactic acid will be produced through this anaerobic pathway, and lactic acid can then enter into the bloodstream and go to different parts of the body. So the liver, kidneys, and heart can actually use lactic acid as fuel, and then lactic acid can be converted back into pyruvic acid or glucose by the liver, so it can kind of do the reverse reaction. Now, lactic acid also contributes to muscle soreness during intense exercise, so it can start to kind of cause some of this muscle pain when you're in a really kind of intense workout of some kind. In anaerobic respiration, usually when we talk about anaerobic respiration, we talk about how it doesn't make very much ATP compared to aerobic respiration, but it happens at a lot faster rate, which is important for the muscles. So the muscles need to be able to produce ATP very quickly, and anaerobic respiration can provide that ATP quicker than it would be if we have the aerobic pathway. So now we're going to talk about the last pathway, which is the aerobic pathway, so when oxygen is present. And this is going to be kind of the full reaction of the cellular respiration, so all of the different stages has to take place with oxygen. And so it's going to be able to produce about 95% of the ATP during rest and also during light to moderate exercise. Like I said previously, this is going to be slower than anaerobic pathway. There's more steps that have to take place, and so it's going to happen very quickly, but slower than our anaerobic pathway. There are going to be a series of chemical reactions that take place, both in the cytosol and also in the mitochondria. The ones in the mitochondria require oxygen, because oxygen is going to be the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. During the process of cellular respiration, you take glucose and you turn it into carbon dioxide and water, which are both waste products basically in this, and then a large amount of ATP. Approximately 32 ATP, but that number can vary. And the fuels that are used for aerobic respiration are going to be glucose, that is from glycogen that's stored in muscle fibers, and also there's going to be glucose that's circulating in the blood, and also free fatty acids. And after about 30 minutes of exercise, your fatty acids are going to turn over and be the main fuel of producing the ATP. So when you start to exercise or play some type of sport, you can use different energy systems for kind of providing the energy for contraction. Now, when we have aerobic endurance, this is going to be the length of time the muscle is going to be able to contract using aerobic pathways. Okay, and so this is going to happen in light to moderate activity and can continue for hours. So if you think about running something like a marathon, where most of us would not consider this light to moderate activity, but they are running slower than something like a sprinter, and they can continue to do that for hours and hours. Well, some of them can do that marathon in less than 2 hours, but regardless, they are going to be able to use the aerobic pathway. Now then there's this thing called the anaerobic threshold, which is the point at which the muscle metabolism has to convert to anaerobic pathway. And so too much ATP is being used, there's not enough oxygen present, and you are going to start having to do the anaerobic pathway. Okay, so here is kind of a comparison of where the energy sources are coming from during kind of a short duration activity and then a prolonged duration activity. So in the blue, we have a short duration, high intensity exercise. So let's think this could be running a 100-yard dash, something that's going to be sprinting wise, but not going to last for very long. Okay. So in the first 6 seconds, you're going to use ATP that is stored in the muscles. Okay. So about after 6 seconds, that ATP is going to be depleted, and we're going to need to switch over to a new way of kind of regenerating the ATP. For the next 10 seconds, ATP can be formed with creatine phosphate. Okay, and so this is going to be called direct phosphorylation, where we take ADP and we transfer the phosphate on creatine phosphate to ADP, creating ATP. Then for the next 30 to 40 seconds, glycogen stored in the muscles is broken down to glucose, which is then going to be oxidized into ATP. Okay, and this can happen kind of in the anaerobic pathway. So this is high intensity exercise, so you're not, if you've ever watched sprinting, they actually are not taking that many breaths during the sprint, and it's because it's not really going to help them. Their muscles are not going to get enough oxygen in that period of time to do aerobic respiration, and so anaerobic pathway is going to be how the ATP is going to be generated. Now, if we switch over to the orange box, this is going to be prolonged duration. So this can last hours. So think about cyclists that are riding the Tour de France or some long cycling race, or marathoners, ultra marathoners, triathlon, things like that. They're going to have to use kind of an aerobic pathway in order to have enough ATP to last for this long period of time. Okay, and they are going to use not just glucose from their glycogen, but also can use other fuels in this anaerobic pathway. Now, as the muscles continue to contract over long periods of time, they will start to fatigue. And fatigue is going to be the physiological inability to contract despite there being stimulation for contraction. Now, this can happen for a couple different reasons. And the first we're going to talk about is going to be ionic imbalances, which can cause fatigue. So the levels of potassium, sodium, and calcium can change, and that can then disrupt the membrane potential of the muscle cell. So as action potentials are transmitted, potassium is going to be lost from muscle cells to the fluids of the T-tubules, and sodium is going to be gained. And these ionic changes will disturb the membrane potential of the muscle cell. They also will reduce the size of the action potential, which reduces the movement of the voltage-sensitive proteins in the T-tubules, which then reduces the amount of calcium that is released. Okay. There also can be problems with increased inorganic phosphate from the creatine phosphate and also from ATP breakdown. And this can interfere with calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and may even hamper the power. The next possible cause of muscle fatigue is decreased ATP and increased magnesium. So ATP is normally going to bind magnesium, and as the ATP levels drop because you're using it, magnesium levels will rise. And both the low ATP and high magnesium levels will act on the voltage-sensitive proteins in the T-tubule, which then decrease the calcium that is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And we don't normally talk about magnesium and ATP, but magnesium is an important molecule that kind of helps stabilize ATP when it's in its high energy state. The last one we're going to talk about is decreased glycogen. If there is not enough glycogen stored in the muscles, then the muscles will fatigue at a quicker rate. Now, this is the kind of idea behind carbo loading. So one reason why athletes carbo load kind of the day before, 2 days before a big competition is because they want to make sure that they have adequate supplies of glycogen, that when they are kind of performing, they are not going to run out of glucose, okay? Because glycogen is going to be the stores of glucose for the muscles. Right? Lack of ATP in itself is rarely going to be the reason why a muscle fatigues, except when the muscles are severely stressed. And so you can maybe see this if someone has gone way beyond their kind of normal activity level and is basically reached their limit, then the muscles may lack necessary ATP. So the last thing we want to talk about when it comes to kind of energy and muscles is this idea of the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And so after a sporting event or some type of extreme exercise, or any exercise really, your muscle needs to return to its pre-exercise state. Okay, so you need to have stores of ATP, you need to have creatine phosphate ready, you need to have glycogen present, okay, and all of that is going to require oxygen consumption. Okay, so the oxygen reserves need to be replenished. Lactic acid needs to be reconverted to pyruvic acid so that you can build up some more ATP. Glycogen stores need to be replaced. ATP and creatine phosphate reserves also has to be resynthesized. Okay, and all of that is going to require extra oxygen after kind of exercise. And this is going to be called the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. Okay, it used to be called oxygen jet, but is no longer referred to it as that. So we're now going to move over and talk about force of muscle contraction, and specifically kind of how force, velocity, and duration of muscle contractions are going to be determined by different factors. Okay, so the force of muscle contractions are going to have four main factors that are going to kind of affect them. Okay, so the force of contraction depends largely on the number of cross bridges that are attached, and that is going to be affected by these four things. The first is that the number of muscle fibers stimulated. Okay, so this is going to be considered recruitment. So the more motor units recruited, the greater the force. Okay, and so we've already talked a little bit about this and recruitment. Okay, so the more motor units you have, the greater the force you're going to be able to produce. The second thing is going to be the relative size of the fibers. So the bulkier the muscle, the more tension it can develop. Okay, and so muscle cells will increase in size, which we call hypertrophy, which happens after regular exercise. So again, when you exercise, and you are actually increasing the size of your muscles cells. Now our third factor is going to be the frequency of the stimulation. So the higher the frequency of the stimulation, the greater the force. Okay, and the stimuli are going to be added together. Then the fourth and last is going to be the degree of muscle stretch. So the sarcomeres can be stretched at different levels. Their normal resting length, which is about 80 to 120%, is going to generate the most force, and I'll show you a picture of what this looks like. If a sarcomere is less than 80% resting length, then that means the filaments are overlapping too much, and basically they can't contract any further, so there's not really any force that can be produced. And then if a sarcomere is greater than 120%, the filaments actually don't overlap enough, and the myosin heads are not able to bind to the actin, and so you can't actually produce any force in that way either. Okay, so here's the 4 factors. So you can kind of have a high frequency of stimulation. We've talked about this, the temporal summation and tetanus. Okay, you can also have larger numbers of muscle fibers recruited. You can have larger muscle fibers in general, so more exercise, you're going to increase the number of myofibrils inside. That increases the size of the muscle fibers or the muscle cells. And then you can also have kind of the resting length at the optimal stretch. Okay, and that will then allow for the ultimate optimal level of contractile force. So here is the length and tension relationship of different sarcomeres in the skeletal muscle. So in our first situation, we have kind of a muscle that is kind of so compressed that the thin filaments or the actin will interfere with each other, and you basically cannot shorten any further. And so you'll see that the tension or the percent of maximum tension is going to be pretty low. Okay, if you're anything, much lower than 75%. We then are going to have the optimal, and so during the resting length, so resting length would be the 100%. So right in between 80% to 120% of the resting length, so somewhere in there, you are going to have kind of optimal overlap of the thick and thin filaments, which then means that you basically have the entire thin filament to lead to contraction. Okay, so you have overlap of the myosin heads with actin, and they can then use that to contract. Now, if the muscle is stretched so much, kind of in this last situation where we have 170% stretch, then what happens is that the filaments do not overlap enough, the myosin heads have nothing to actually attach to, and this makes it so that you can't generate tension. Okay, normally what happens is our joints will keep our muscles in their optimal range. Okay, so the joints prevent bone movements that would stretch muscles beyond their optimal. Okay, obviously it can happen if you have some issues and you can actually hurt yourself, and this can cause non-optimal, but we kind of remain in the optimal area most of the time. The past slides have been about force, and now we can talk about velocity and duration of the contraction. So how fast the muscle can contract and for how long is going to depend on the muscle fiber type, the load, and the recruitment of the muscle fibers. So when we're looking at muscle fiber type, they're going to be able to be classified in 2 different ways based on these characteristics. So the first is going to be the speed of contraction, and there can be slow muscle fibers and fast muscle fibers. And these slow and fast fibers are going to depend on the speed at which the myosin ATPase splits the ATP. Okay, so you're going to have different speeds depending on where the muscle fiber is from and what kind it is. And you're also going to have different patterns of electrical activity of the motor neurons, so how those respond as well. The duration is going to largely depend on how quickly calcium is taken out of the cytosol inside the muscle cell and put back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The second characteristic is going to be the metabolic pathway used for ATP synthesis. And so in the first part of this lecture, we talked about the 3 different pathways that can be used, and different muscle fibers are going to tend to use one pathway over another type. So there are some fibers that are going to be oxidative, and these are going to use aerobic pathways. So think oxidative, oxygen using, and the only pathway of ATP synthesis that we talked about that uses oxygen directly is going to be the aerobic pathway. The second type is these glycolytic fibers, which are going to use anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, so they're going to do this in the absence of oxygen. So based on both kind of the actual speed of contraction and the metabolic pathway, you can then kind of take skeletal muscle fibers and classify them in 3 different types. So you can have slow oxidative fibers, fast oxidative fibers, or fast glycolytic fibers. Okay, most muscles are going to contain a mixture of the different fiber types, which then is going to allow for different contractile speeds and also fatigue resistance, because these different types of skeletal muscle will actually fatigue at different rates. Okay, all fibers that are going to be connected via one motor unit will be the same type. Okay, and that should make sense because the electrical stimuli is going to be important in how I determine that type of muscle contraction. Okay, and then depending on your genetics, that will then dictate how many of each type you have. And we do know that there are individuals that have one type over another. We often look at sprinters versus marathoners, and they tend to have a different composition of muscle fiber types that kind of work better for the different activities that they have. So different muscle fibers are going to be better suited for different jobs, and so we're going to talk about 3 different situations. So for slow oxidative fiber, this is going to be for a low intensity activity and also endurance activities. Okay, so for example, when you're maintaining your posture, you're going to tend to be kind of using slow oxidative fibers at a higher rate than you would the other types of fibers. Fast oxidative fibers are for medium intensity activities. And so this could be sprinting or walking, and they're going to allow you to kind of have a pretty fast contraction, but also still use oxygen. Okay, and then fast glycolytic fibers are going to be for short-term or very powerful movements. Okay, and a good example of this is going to be hitting a baseball. So again, depending on the type of activity that you're going to use, you're going to have different types. And we will go over kind of the different, kind of what all the differences are between these different types of muscle fibers. Okay, so here we have the different types of muscle fibers, and depending on which type we're looking at, they're going to have different characteristics. So for example, if we're looking at the slow oxidative fiber, they're going to contract slowly, and it's mainly because they're going to have kind of a myosin ATPase that is has a slow activity. Okay, it's going to depend on oxygen delivery and aerobic pathways. Okay, so its main kind of pathway is going to be ATP that is generated by high oxidative capacity. It's going to resist fatigue and has high endurance, which is typical of fibers that depend on aerobic metabolism. It's going to tend to be thin because a large amount of cytoplasm impedes diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from the blood, so it needs to be relatively thin. Okay, and has relatively little power. Okay, and so if you have a thin cell, in general, that's going to limit the number of myofibrils that you can have inside of it. It's going to tend to have lots of mitochondria because it uses a lot of oxygen, and it's going to have a rich capillary supply, again, to deliver that oxygen. It's going to tend to be red, and that is going to come from an abundant supply of myoglobin, which is going to be the muscle oxygen binding pigment. Okay, so those are going to be best for endurance type activities. If we then look at fast glycolytic fibers, those are going to contract rapidly because they have a fast myosin ATPase. They use very little oxygen. They're going to depend on a lot of glycogen reserves for their fuel rather than any blood-delivered nutrients. They are going to tire quickly because glycogen reserves are short-lived, and it does fatigue. So it will start to kind of have issues with being able to contract after a while. It's going to generally have a large diameter, which kind of gives it lots of myofilaments that allow it to contract powerfully before it can tire out. Okay, and it's going to lack, it lacks a dependence on continuous oxygen and nutrient diffusion, which allows it to get bigger. Okay, because remember, if you have, relying highly on oxygen, you have to have a thin fiber. Okay, it's going to have relatively few mitochondria and very little myoglobin and few capillaries. So it makes it kind of a palish white color. Okay, and then if you look at fast oxidative fibers, they're going to be kind of in the middle, and they're going to have intermediate characteristics between the slow oxidative fibers and the fast glycolytic fibers. Okay, so they're going to have intermediate glycogen stores and power, Like fast glycolytic fibers, they can contract quickly, but like slow oxidative fibers, they are oxygen dependent and have rich supply of myoglobin and capillaries. Okay, and so depending on the different characteristics of the muscle fibers, you're going to have different types of activities that are better suited for those. This figure shows that if you have a high predominance of fast glycolytic fibers, they will increase your contractile velocity. Okay, if you have a predominance of slow oxidative fibers, they will increase your contractile duration. And then in the middle, you have kind of, if you have a small load or increased recruitment, you can then increase contractile velocity and contractile duration. Now, the previous slides went over how muscle type is actually going to affect the velocity and duration, but we still have load and recruitment to discuss. So when we think of load, we need to think about kind of the resistance to the contraction. Because muscles are attached to bones, they are always going to be pitted against some resistance when they contract. Okay, and so when muscles contract fastest is when they have no load added to them. And the greater the load there is, the shorter the duration of the contraction and the slower the contraction will be. Now, when it comes to recruitment, the more motor units contracting, the faster and more prolonged the contraction can be. So here we have an image showing kind of different loads and how they're going to affect the distance shortened. Okay, so if you have a very light load, you can actually shorten your muscle much more than you would have if you have an intermediate load or a heavy load. Okay, and also that the heavier load is going to have a longer latent period because you are going to require more kind of recruitment to happen. And so that's why you're seeing the heavy load moving 20 milliseconds after the stimulus as opposed to much quicker when you have a light load or intermediate load. Okay, and the velocity of the shortening, so as you increase the load, the velocity is going to decrease. Okay, so the greater the load, the slower the muscle will shorten. The last thing I want to discuss for this lecture is how your muscles can adapt to exercise. Now, our first type of exercise is going to be aerobic or endurance exercise, and this is going to include things like running, swimming, and cycling. Okay? If you do these types of aerobic exercises, you can then have your muscles change in these different ways. So you can have increased muscle capillaries, number of mitochondria, and the myoglobin synthesis can increase as well. Now, this results in a greater endurance of the muscle, strength, and resistance to fatigue. Okay, so these kind of different activities, specifically if they're endurance activities, they are able to exercise for very long periods of time. And yes, their muscles are going to get tired, but it's going to take a lot longer than someone that is not used to aerobic endurance exercises. Okay, you also can convert fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative fibers if you exercise this way. The second type of exercising is resistance exercising, and this is typically going to be anaerobic, okay, because you're doing very short, quick, powerful actions. And weightlifting or isometric exercises are going to lead to this. Okay, your muscles can hypertrophy, which means that they're going to get larger. This is primarily due to the increase in fiber size. Okay, and then you can have increased mitochondria, myofilaments, glycogen stores, and connective tissue. Okay, this is going to then increase the muscle strength and size and allow you to be even more kind of powerful and strong after. In order for your muscles to stay healthy, they have to remain active. There's something called disuse atrophy where you have degeneration and loss of your muscle mass. Okay, and this is usually due to some type of immobilization or loss of neural stimulation. So if you break a bone and you have to have a cast on and you're unable to kind of use your muscle in the same way that it could be used, you can start to have some degeneration. And if you have neural stimulation that's lost and you're not able to contract your muscles, that also can lead to this atrophy. And this can begin very quickly after kind of the immobilization happens. Okay, so muscle strength can decline by 5% a day, and paralyzed muscles may atrophy to their kind of 1/4 of their initial size, so much smaller than they started off. Okay, and the fibrous connective tissue can actually replace the muscle tissue if it's severe enough, which then makes it so it's not even able to contract because connective tissue doesn't have that same ability. And sometimes rehabilitation is impossible if you've replaced your muscle tissue with connective tissue.